All right, AMP1 students, we are going to talk about the neuron and primarily its anatomy in this video. So this is the picture that they have in the textbook, but it does label a lot of things that I actually won't ask you about. So let me go over the structures that I will ask you about. So when we're talking about I'm going to enlarge that too. When we're talking about the neuron, remember it's a really big cell. It's got the long processes. So we're going to start up here. So the parts that you should be familiar with, and again, you have this anatomy that you have to know for lab as well. So you should know the dendrites. So you should be able to identify them on a picture. You should know the cell body. Oops. And then you should know the axon hillock, because we'll talk about that when we start talking about the physiology of the neuron. So that's kind of the beginning of the axon here. And then, of course, the axon, which is the longest process, goes down here. And then also the axon terminals. Again, the textbook will call them synaptic knobs, synaptic bulbs. There's kind of a bunch of names for them, and I apologize, but I like to just call them axon terminals. And then the other two structures that you learn in lab and you'll need to know is the myelin sheath. So this is one of the myelin sheaths. There's another one there too. And then the little gap between the myelin sheaths is the node of Ranvier, or if you want to call it neurofibril node, it has two names. So that is the structures that you should be able to identify on a picture in lecture of the axon. And it's important to know that anatomy, because when we talk about the physiology, it'll be important to understand what part of the neuron that we're talking about. All right, so that was our objective over describing the structures of the neurons. Now we're going to talk about how we categorize neurons. So this is our structural categories of neurons. So we have 4 types, and I'll slide it up so you can see that last picture. We have multipolar neurons, and that's the one that we primarily, when we draw a neuron, we usually draw a multipolar neuron. We have a bipolar neuron, a unipolar neuron, and an anaxonic neuron. So we'll start with the multipolar ones. So it's called multipolar. If you look at the cell body, you'll notice that there's multiple processes coming off of that cell body. So we have all the dendrites here, and then we have the one long axon. So that's why they call it multipolar neuron, because there's multiple processes coming off of that cell body. This is the most common type of neuron, so this is generally the one we always draw or show pictures of when we're talking about a neuron. So all our motor neurons are considered a multipolar neuron, and some of our interneurons, which are the ones that are just located in the central nervous system, those are also considered multipolar. But we do have some bipolar neurons. So again, if you look at your cell body, you'll notice there's a process here and a process there. So bi meaning 2. So there's 2 processes coming off of the cell body. So they call it bipolar neuron. And one of those processes is like one big dendrite with branches, and then the other side is an axon with branches, with little axon terminals. So if we think about our special senses, which we're starting to talk about soon in lab, so we think about our little neurons that are in our retina of our eye, the neurons that are located in the roof of our nasal cavity for our sense of smell. Some of those are shaped like this, where it's a bipolar neuron. So we'll get a stimulus at this end, and it'll travel along the dendrite to the cell body, and then down the axon to the next cell. So those aren't as common. They're just found in a couple of places within the nervous system. All right, and our third type is a unipolar neuron. So if you look at the cell body, you'll see there's just one single short process coming off of it. So that's why they call it uni, meaning one. And then off of that single short process, you have a central process and a peripheral process. So this one's really funky looking. Doesn't look like the typical one. So this whole part is the axon, and then there's the dendrites down here. So it's very, very strange. And so this is the type that you will find in the sensory neurons. Remember, those are the neurons that are taking signals from our peripheral nervous system back to our central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord. So that's what they're shaped like. So much different shape than our motor neurons are. But they allow for the little dendrites here at the end. Those will they'll be kind of modified and they'll serve as receptors. So then that information will travel along there and then along the axon. All right, and then the very last structural type of neuron is the anaxonic. So when we put the A in front of it, it means absence of axon here. So this is one where we have a cell body and then we have a bunch of dendrites, but that's all. We don't have an axon. So you'll find these primarily in the central nervous system. These are not in the peripheral nervous system. So they're in the central nervous system. Most of them are called interneurons because they're communicating between two different neurons in the central nervous system. So they just don't have an axon, so they call it anaxonic. So those are our 4 types of structural neurons that you should be familiar with. And when we talk about the functional classes of neurons, we've had this objective in lab. We're talking about sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. So we will call neurons, classify them based on which way they are taking a nerve impulse or an action potential. So if they're going from receptors in the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, like the brain and spinal cord, we call them sensory neurons. So this is showing like receptors in the skin, and then there's a sensory neuron. So we have our little sensory neuron that's kind of light blue here. And then it'll go and form a synapse and communicate with another neuron that's just located in the central nervous system. So in this case, this one's located in the spinal cord, but this could be the brain too. So this little interneuron, it is going to just be in the CNS, and its function is to collect information from sensory neurons and then relay that information to motor neurons. So it's kind of the primary, a lot of the interneurons in our CNS are kind of the ones that are evaluating and processing information that's coming in and deciding what to do, like, what other information it should send along to other neurons. So been just located in the CNS, interneurons are. And then the third functional class is the motor neuron. So this is the motor neuron here that's red, and it goes down to, in this case, a muscle. And so that is a motor neuron, and its role and function is to take a signal from the CNS, in this case spinal cord, somewhere to a muscle or effector. So it could be a muscle, it could be a gland. In this case, it's a muscle. And then it will cause stimulation of that effector. So it's always going from the signal or action potential is always going from the CNS to the effectors in the peripheral nervous system. So you should be familiar with those 3 functional classes for our neurons. All right, and the last thing in this video we're going to talk about, and we've talked about it in the previous chapter, or chapter 10, the previous chapter we covered, is a synapse. So remember that a synapse is just that area or location where we have communication between 2 cells. And generally one of the cells is a neuron, and then the other cell could be another neuron, or it could be a muscle cell, or it could be a gland cell. So that if it's a neuron and a muscle cell, remember we call that synapse a neuromuscular junction. It has a special name, but it's still a synapse. So that's the definition of a synapse. So there are, though, two different synapses within our nervous system. The first one is a chemical synapse, and that one is the most common one. So a chemical synapse happens between two neurons, and what will happen is a neurotransmitter will be secreted or released from the axon terminal of a neuron, and then it will travel across the synaptic cleft and then bind to the receptors for that neurotransmitter that's on the next neuron. So they call it a chemical synapse because there's a chemical, which is a neurotransmitter, that's being released and taking that information from one neuron to the next neuron or cell. So those are the most common ones in our nervous system. But we do have a second type of synapse. It's called an electrical synapse. And this is where we actually have the two neurons. They're actually physically bound together. So remember that these two aren't physically bound together, the two neurons. There's a little cleft or space between those two cells where they're going to communicate with each other. So this one, they're actually physically bound together. And so any sort of electrical signal that's coming down the first neuron is going to be transferred directly to the second neuron. So they are going to communicate that way. And that happens like much more quickly. So with a chemical synapse, because you have to wait for the chemical to be released and then travel across the synaptic cleft and then bind, there's a little bit of a delay. It takes a little bit longer to transmit that information from one cell to the next. So where electrical synapse, it happens like very, very quickly. But again, those aren't as common ones. They're just in a few places in the nervous system. But they do exist, so we should be familiar with them. Okay, so in our next video, we will talk about the glial cells. So we'll specifically talk about those cells that are in the nervous tissue that are there for support and protection of our neurons. And so there's 4, 5, 6 of them that we'll talk about and be familiar with. And then we'll also talk about some disorders too. So I will see you in the next video.